My name is Margaret Maggie Carver. I'm 67 years old, and I live alone in a small saltbox house in Vermont. Last winter, at my eldest son's dinner table, they told me to sit down and be quiet, like I was some relic they'd kept out of pity. They said I was just the widow, as if 45 years of building this family from scratch meant nothing without a man still breathing beside me. That was the night I stopped trying to fit into the space they allowed me, because I knew something they didn't. Not please, not well, circle back, quiet, as if grief had turned me into furniture with a pulse. I had ironed my blouse twice before I drove over. I checked my lipstick 3 times in the rear view and promised myself I wouldn't cry. Not in front of people who'd started talking about me, like I was a problem to solve. We were at my eldest son's place, The Glass, and Stone One just outside Brattleboro, all picture windows and curated throw blankets. Daniel poured a too-aggressive pint like a man auditioning for a Napa brochure, while Vanessa clacked in gold heels, moving dishes with the entitlement of a stage manager who's also the star. My younger son, Lucas, gave me a nod from the end of the table. It was the kind of nod you give a neighbor you only know by the color of their mailbox. I had brought an apple pie because Richard, my husband, always swore mine could make a hard day softer. I set it on the counter next to a cookbook that had never met a splash of sauce in its life. No one looked up. The dining room smelled like roasted rosemary, and something burning that no one wanted to admit was burning. We've been thinking it's best to simplify, Daniel said as soon as everyone sat. 9 of us, around a table I gave them last Christmas. Simplify is a generous word. It's what you call it when power gets redistributed in a direction you favor. I assume this is about the cabin, the house, the retirement accounts, I said, being careful with my voice, the way you approach a skittish horse. Vanessa didn't glance up from her phone. You're just the widow, Margaret. Maybe let the adults handle the details. The room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when someone says the thing everyone else has been implying. Daniel chuckled like it was a clever line. Lucas exhaled like he'd been holding his breath, waiting for the moment to arrive. My hands shook beneath the table. Not because I was afraid, but because there's a fresh grief that shows up when you realize you're the only one at a family dinner who still remembers what the family cost. I set my fork down. I didn't make a speech. I didn't ask for respect that should have been a given. I stood, left the pie untouched, and walked out. The front door clicked shut behind me, and for the first time in 45 years, silence didn't feel like abandonment. It felt like oxygen. They didn't follow. They didn't call out, "Mom." The porch lights, warm and polite, watched me like a stranger walking down a private road. I drove home with both hands on the wheel and a steady, empty head. Grief needs an audience, dignity does not. Inside my little saltbox house, I did what you do after a storm. You take stock. I slipped off my flats, folded my cardigan over the arm of the couch, and sat in Richard's old recliner, the ugly brown one I threatened to toss for 20 years. My throw blanket, frayed edges, a coffee stain shaped like Vermont, was waiting. I pulled it over my knees and stared at the shelf of mismatched mugs we'd collected from a life that was ordinary and honest and ours. Just the widow, I said into the quiet, and the quiet held still. At 2:17 a.m. I stood, not because I had a plan, because I couldn't stand feeling like a misplaced thing in my own life. I padded down the hall to Richard's study. I hadn't changed much since the funeral. His pencils were sharpened to neat little spears. His ledger lay at a right angle to the blotter like an obedient child. We kept a small fireproof safe beneath the bottom shelf, our boring box, he called it, passports, old wills, titles. The sorts of papers that decide who you are when you can't speak for yourself. My fingers were cold as I spun the dial. I didn't know what I was looking for. Maybe a reason to keep being generous. There it was, in the back. A heavy white envelope with my name in Richard's neat print, Maggie. Only when needed. Richard didn't write notes. He showed love in rotated tires and gutters that never clogged. I sat in his chair, broke the seal, and unfolded a single page. Mags, if you're reading this, I didn't tell you sooner, because you try to fix everybody instead of protecting yourself. The boys. God help me. I love them. But they grew up assuming the ladder would always be there. Vanessa saw a gap and started measuring it. When the doctor said the word that empties a room, I called Harold and changed the documents. Everything funnels to you. The house, the lake, the accounts. You hold it cleanly. If they call you cruel for using it, remember this. We skipped vacations to build this life. We ate soup in August. Cruel is letting your work be spent by people who never learned how to earn. You don't owe them access. You owe yourself peace. Beneath the letter was a neat stack of notarized copies, durable power of attorney, retitled properties, bank authorizations, a dissolution of a family trust I didn't even know he'd bothered to create in the first place. Stamp dates. Shields, 8 months old. Executed while we were using up the last of our luck in waiting rooms that smelled like hand sanitizer and fear. I pressed my palm over his name until the indentation warmed under my skin. The study watched me, patient. The house held its breath the way homes do when they remember you back. When I stood, I was no longer trying to be the most reasonable person in the room. I was a woman with a lever. At 3041, I called our lawyer. Everyone in a small town has a lawyer, the one who sends your kids birthday cards until they age out into mortgages. Harold Finch picked up on the 5th ring, voice gravelly, heart already awake. Harold, it's Maggie Carver. I found a letter, and I found all of it. Anyone else know? He asked, alert now. No. Good. Don't tell them. Can you come in at 9? Bring everything. I looked at the clock like I could push the hands faster. I'll be there. The sky grayed by inches. I made tea I didn't drink. I wrote a list on the back of an envelope because women like me can do grief and a to-do list in the same hour. On the fridge, beneath a magnet shaped like a moose, Daniel's kindergarten drawing of a stick family smiled back at me. The paper had browned at the edges. The 4 of us held hands in marker. The tiny blue house had a chimney that leaned like it was tired but proud. I slid the drawing beneath a cookbook. Some days, you have to be the person who puts away the tender things so they don't get hurt. Harold was waiting in his office when I arrived. The reception area smelled like burnt coffee and lemon cleaner. A plant I'd given him 2 Christmases ago had the decency to still look alive. He had the files spread out like a battle map. When his eyes fell on the envelope that said only when needed, his mouth softened. Richard always did like a dramatic title, he said. We worked for 2 hours, and by worked, I mean Harold translated law into human, and I initialed, signed, and asked the kinds of questions that make men underestimate you. We confirmed transfers Richard had set up, executed the ones that needed my hand, notified the bank manager whose daughter I used to bring an extra cupcake to at school bake sales. Papers were scanned, calls were made. By 11:12 a.m., there was no ambiguity left in the world that mattered. Every asset, account, and property Richard and I sweated into being rested under my authority. Harold clicked his pen, set it down, and leaned back. Would you like to notify them, or would you prefer they discover it organically? Organically, I said. Let the realization do the speech for me. He gave me a look I recognized from Little League, the one dads gave me when they realized I could throw cleaner than they expected. Then go home and make yourself lunch, Mrs. Carver. And don't answer the phone. I didn't. I drove the long way. Past the diner Richard once managed for 3 months when the owner had a heart attack. Past the consignment shop where I found the dress I was wearing now for $22 and an honest thrill. The cold bit at the fields like a tidy dog. In my driveway, I sat for a minute with the engine off, the quiet pressing him politely, and I listened to what it had to say. You're not the role they wrote for you. Inside, I spread the signed documents on my dining table. I ate a sandwich over the sink because civilized meals are for people who aren't busy becoming something new. My phone hummed on the counter at 3:06 p.m. Daniel, Mom, weird thing. Do you know why the lake account is locked? I put the phone face down and rinsed my plate. At 3:11, Vanessa called. I let it go to voicemail. Her voice when I listened later had that bright edge women use when they want something from other women, but can't bring themselves to ask nicely. We're all a little confused here, she said. Call me. At 4:29, Lucas texted, did something change with the house access? Not something, everything. I waited until 5 o'clock. You learn a family's rhythms when you've packed their lunches and paid their orthodontist. I knew they'd reconvene at Daniel's, because people who prefer control prefer home field advantage. I put the papers back in a folder, grabbed my coat, and drove over without calling first. The porch light flicked on before I reached for the bell. The front door opened like a stage cue. Daniel's smile was the kind that doesn't involve the eyes. We were just about to call you. I know, I said, stepping inside. I set the folder on the kitchen island, slid out the top page, and rotated it toward them. This is the estate plan. There's no board, there's no committee, there's no we. There's me, Daniel snorted. You can't just move money around. I didn't, I said. Richard did. 8 months ago, I executed what he planned. You'd know that if you read things before signing them or marrying them. Vanessa's mouth tightened. She reached for the papers with 2 nails like surgical tongs. This isn't binding. I handed her the notarized copy with Harold's stamp. Her eyes paused on the raised seal. The kitchen went very quiet. This isn't a negotiation, I said. It's a notice. Lucas hovered in the doorway like a boy stuck between a campfire and the dark woods. For once, he didn't try to joke the air back into the room. I gathered the papers neatly, slid them back into the folder, and walked to the door. My hand was on the knob when I turned. The next time you want to discuss my future, I said, you'll make an appointment. The night air was clean and mean on my cheeks. I walked to my car with a spine I hadn't felt since I was 30. I didn't wish them a good evening. Wishing requires hope for the other person. I had none to spare. Back home, the old drip coffee maker sputtered like it always does when it's almost done. I leaned against the counter, watching the steam rise in lazy strands, and waited for the thud in my chest to even out. My phone lit the room like a fish tank. 5 missed calls, 7 messages. I didn't open any of them. I let the quiet do what quiet does best. Sort the important from the loud. Near midnight, I walked back into Richard's study. I pulled out his ledger and flipped to the back. In his slanted hand were 2 short lines from last spring: double, check Daniels, borrowed, funds. Ask Harold about dissolving board. He had seen the water seeping under the door and set sandbags I didn't even notice. Grief is strange. It can sit down at your table and also stand behind you like a blessing. I went to the hall, opened the coat closet, and pulled the little fireproof pouch we used for passports and overly important coupons. I slid Richard's letter inside, then the fresh documents, then the sticky note I peeled off my fridge after I put the kindergarten drawing away. It said, in my hand, you've done enough apologizing. I slept 3 hours, a heavy, untroubled block like a cinder set down gently. Before sunrise, I drove out to the lake cabin alone. 30-odd minutes on a 2-lane that cuts through fields the color of old rope. The cabin isn't a postcard. It's 2 bedrooms and a porch that leans like it's listening, cedar that begs for oil, a dock that complains when the ice goes out. The water held still under a skin of frost. I unlocked the door and inhaled that damp, clean smell of wood that's earned its keep. I opened every window, Richard's ritual, so the place could breathe. I ran the kitchen tap until the cough turned to a strong stream. I folded the blanket on the sofa the way he liked it, edge to edge, patient. Then I sat at the small pine table with my coffee in both hands and set the folder in front of me like a book I loved too much to rush. I didn't come here to decide. I had already decided. I came to say it out loud where the walls knew my name. I'm not the widow you think I am, I told the empty room. It didn't argue. By the time the light turned from blue to honest daylight, I was ready. I locked the windows. I wiped the last bit of condensation off the sink with the dish towel no one else ever folds right. I stood on the porch and watched a pair of loons make a dark seam across the water. On the drive back, my phone hummed itself hoarse. I let it. Some lessons are improved by silence. When I turned onto my street, a young woman stood by my mailbox, hood up, hands jammed into her coat. She looked at my house as if it were a memory she was trying to get right. "Can I help you?" I asked through the rolled-down window. She stepped closer, cautious. "Are you Mrs. Carver?" "Yes." She exhaled like she'd been holding her breath for a mile. "I'm Nora. I work at the diner off Route 30. I'm sorry to bother you. Your husband used to bring me pie on graveyard shifts when I was pregnant. He said if I ever needed a quiet place to talk, you were the person." Richard and his halo of inconvenient kindness. Of course. "What do you need, Nora?" She looked past me to the little house with the crooked fence. "Someone wants me to sign something I don't want to sign. They say it's just to keep things simple. I don't know what simple looks like when the pen is in their hand." I parked, got out, and opened the front door. "Come in," I said. "I have coffee that tastes like honesty and a table that remembers how to keep secrets." We sat. She talked. I listened. Not because I'm a saint, but because the fastest way to remember your own power is to lend someone a little of it. When she left, she hugged herself like she was keeping something from spilling out. At the door she said, "Thank you. I don't feel crazy anymore." "You're not?" I said. "Crazy is when people mistake their convenience for your duty." After she was gone, I stood in my kitchen with the folder again. The papers felt lighter than they had the day before. Not because they mattered less, but because I had stopped being afraid of what would happen if I used them. My phone chimed with a text from Daniel, "Can we just talk?" Not yet, I thought. Talking is what people suggest when they're hoping the facts will soften into something they can live with. I set the folder on the table, right where the morning made a square of light. I watched the light move across the manila like a blessing or a bullseye. Harold's words echoed, "Notify them, or let them find out." I'm a practical woman. I like to let things work as designed, so I made a cup of tea. I sat in Richard's chair. I folded my hands in my lap like my mother taught me to when I was a girl in a church we could barely afford to tie the two. And I waited for the day to do what days do: carry news from one house to another. By the time the sun touched the maple across the street, I felt it settle inside me, the thing that had been rattling loose since the funeral. Not rage, not triumph. Something closer to gravity. They wanted me quiet. What they'll get is consequence. And in the morning, when they wake to accounts that no longer open for them, to doors that require keys they don't have, to a world that finally reflects the truth instead of their plans, well, let the realization make the speech I didn't. The phone woke me before the sun did. I don't set alarms anymore. Not since Richard died. The world makes enough noise without me scheduling it. But that morning the ringtone, sharp, persistent, cut through the stillness like a saw through clean wood. I didn't answer. I just lay there in the half-light, watching the ceiling fan make slow, lazy rotations, the way it did when we'd lie here and talk about nothing important. By the time I sat up, the machine had caught 3 messages. One from Daniel, one from Lucas, and, of course, one from Vanessa. All different voices, all bending toward the same pitch: confusion, dressed in politeness, hiding panic. "Mom, we need to talk about some changes," Daniel's voice said. He sounded like he was calling a client, not his mother. "Maggie, it's Lucas. I think there's been some kind of mix-up at the bank," came next. And then Vanessa, clipped and bright. "Margaret, could you call me back? Something's wrong with the accounts, and the attorney isn't answering us." I poured coffee before I listened to the rest. The mug warmed my hands, but my mind was cool and sharp. They were already circling, The cracks had formed. Now it was just a matter of waiting for the break. At 9:12, Daniel sent a text. "Can we meet today? No question mark." It wasn't really a question. I didn't answer. By noon, Harold called. "They've been trying to access the cabin's account and the main investment portfolio. Both are locked. Security flagged multiple failed logins from Daniel's laptop." "Good," I said. "Let them dig. Holes are useful when they're the ones falling in." He chuckled the way men do when they think you're being metaphorical. I wasn't. By 3, Vanessa showed up in my driveway without warning. She was wearing oversized sunglasses like a soap opera star, caught buying her own groceries. And she didn't even bother with a hello. "Why would you do this behind our backs?" she demanded, as if I'd rearranged the furniture in her house without permission. I didn't invite her in. Maybe because I knew what you'd do in front of them. That landed. She flinched before adjusting her grip on the leather tote slung over her arm. "We could have figured this out together," she said. "We still can," I replied. "Figure it out separately." She tried a half-hearted threat about lawyers, but I closed the door before she finished. Some conversations deserved to be cut short. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with Richard's folder in front of me and made a new list. It wasn't about protecting the assets anymore. That part was done. This was about deciding what to do with the truth, now that it was entirely mine to shape. I could give them a slow drip, just enough reality to keep them cautious. Or I could pour the whole bucket over their heads at once and watch them sputter. I was still weighing it when the phone rang again. This time, the voice on the other end was quiet, hesitant. "Grandma." It was Nora. She'd only been to the house once, but her voice already had that way of finding the soft part of me without trying. "They're freaking out. My mom's talking about moving in with someone. Dad's not himself." "Are you okay?" "I'm fine, sweetheart," I said because it was true. "You didn't do anything wrong?" She hesitated. "Grandpa would have hated this. That's why he fixed it before it broke," I told her. When we hung up, I realized the decision had already been made. The slow drip was for people hoping to keep the peace. I wasn't keeping anything for them anymore. Tomorrow, they'd stop wondering what happened. Tomorrow, they'd know. The next afternoon, the sky over Brattleboro had that sharp, pale light that makes everything look colder than it is. I parked half a block from Daniel's house, folder in hand, and walked the rest of the way. I didn't bother calling ahead. Invitations are for guests. I was coming as the owner. Through the glass front door, I could see them. Daniel pacing near the kitchen island, Lucas slouched against a chair, Vanessa with her arms folded tight, like she could keep the walls from caving in by holding herself together. Daniel opened the door with a tight smile. "Mom, I won't be long." I cut in. The room went quieter as I stepped inside and placed the folder on the table. I didn't sit. I wanted the height. Richard used to say you should never give away a good angle unless you have to. "This," I said, opening the folder, "is the new reality. Every asset, every account, every piece of property Richard and I built is in my name. Sole authority. Sole signature." Lucas frowned. "That's not how the trust works." I looked at him, steady. "There is no trust anymore. Richard dissolved it last year. You'd know that if you'd read what you were signing." Vanessa moved closer, scanning the papers like she could undo them with her eyes. "These can't be binding." I slid the notarized copy toward her. "Harold's signature. County seal. Binding enough to lock every account you've been trying to open." Daniel's jaw worked like he was chewing on words he couldn't swallow. "You can't just." "I didn't just anything," I said. "I executed the plan your father put in place because he knew what would happen if I didn't." For a moment, the only sound was the hum of the refrigerator. No one touched the papers. No one looked me in the eye. "This isn't a negotiation," I continued. "It's a notification. You have no legal claim to any of it. And the next time you want to discuss my future, you'll need an appointment." I closed the folder, slid it back into my bag, and walked to the door. At the threshold I turned. You told me to sit quietly. That was your mistake. You mistook silence for absence. Then I stepped out into the pale winter light and shut the door behind me. The cold air hit my lungs clean. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt settled, like a ledger had finally balanced after years of crooked numbers. Tomorrow, the real unraveling would begin, and I was done pretending it wasn't my hand on the thread. By sunrise the next morning, the unraveling had already started. The first ping on my phone came at 7:43. Daniel, did you change the passwords to the brokerage accounts? I didn't answer. The second came 3 minutes later. Vanessa, the cabin key doesn't work. Did you change the locks? At 8:12, Lucas called. I let it ring out. His voicemail was short, almost quiet. Mom, I can't access the condo account. The building manager says it's under review. What's happening? What's happening is that Richard and I built a life with 5 years of grit, and I just locked the doors to keep it standing. By 10, Harold had already confirmed that the cabin's locks were changed, the SUV's lease was reclaimed, and the downtown condo's income stream was frozen pending. New owner directives. Those directives were mine. Do you want to notify them of the vehicle repossession? Harold asked over the phone. No, I said, stirring sugar into my coffee. Let the tow truck tell the story. By noon, the story was being told in real time. A neighbor texted me a blurry photo of Vanessa, still in her robe, standing in the driveway while a flapid loaded the SUV. Daniel was behind her, phone pressed to his ear, glaring at the driver like anger could change a contract. The photo made me smile, not because I enjoyed the scene, but because for once, the balance of ownership matched the balance of sacrifice. Around 2, the landline rang. When I answered, it wasn't Daniel or Vanessa. It was Nora. They're losing it, she said, her voice low, almost guilty. Mom keeps saying this is illegal. Dad's on his laptop all day trying to fix things. Grandma, are you sure you're okay? I leaned back in Richard's chair, looking at the folder on the desk. Sweetheart, I'm better than okay. I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. There was a pause. They said they're going to call someone. Like official. About you. I knew what she meant before she said it. A capacity evaluation. An old, tired trick. Let them, I said. If they want to start that game, they'd better understand I'm not playing with paper. I'm playing with proof. When we hung up, I called Harold. They'll try to claim I'm unfit. Be ready. I'll do more than ready, he said. I'll make sure whoever writes that claim ends up wishing they'd stayed out of it. 2 days later, the proof slid under my front door, a plain white envelope, no return address. My name printed in a shaky, deliberate hand. I bent down, picked it up, and knew before I even opened it that it was meant to unsettle me. Inside was a single sheet, a copy of a psychiatric recommendation form, unsigned, but with a thick red highlight around the words capacity evaluation recommended. I'd read enough of Richard's legal briefs over the years to recognize the tactic. If they could convince a judge I was mentally unfit, everything I'd secured would be back in play. I didn't feel fear. I felt insult. By 3 that afternoon, I was in Harold's office. I didn't sit until the envelope was on his desk. He skimmed it, his mouth tightening. This is bold. Trace it, I said. I want names. Who requested it, who drafted it, and who thought it was a good idea to slide it under my door like a ransom note? 2 days later, Harold called. His voice had that clipped edge I'd only heard when he was about to enjoy his work a little too much. It's Vanessa. She went to a notary she knows, someone who owes her a favor, and tried to backdate the paperwork. We have emails. One of the assistant clerks handed them over voluntarily. I smiled slow. Why? Because she didn't want to commit a felony on a Sunday morning. Harold said, We're pressing charges. That evening, while I was roasting chicken, my phone buzzed with a message from Nora. They're arresting her. It read. The next line came with a photo, Granny taken from across the street, Vanessa in designer heels, hands cuffed, shouting as a county deputy read her the charges. Fraud, forgery, attempted abuse of the court system. Daniel stood behind her, trying to intervene until the deputy stepped into his path and told him to stand down. She's saying it's your fault. Nora's text continued, but nobody's buying it. Not even Dad. I set the phone down, took the chicken out of the oven, and let the quiet settle. Some victories don't need champagne, just a steady pulse and the knowledge that the board is mine to play. The next morning, Harold called again. She's taking a deal, no trial, pleads down to a fine and probation. But it's on her record? Good, I said. That's permanent, and I meant it. After Vanessa's plea deal, the phone went quiet. Not the kind of quiet that comes from peace. The kind that follows an earthquake, when everyone's too busy counting cracks to make noise. Daniel didn't call. Luca sent one short text. This is a mess. I didn't reply. Silence was doing the work for me. With the fight in court finished, the real work began. Richard hadn't left me all of this just so I could sit on it like a miser. He'd trusted me to protect it, yes, but also to use it. On Monday, I met with Peter, the estate accountant. Transfer the small house on Cedar Hill, I told him. The one with the yellow shutters and the porch swing. Put it in Nora's name. He blinked. That's generous. It's earned, I said. She's the only one who's looked me in the eye without an angle. When I told Nora later that week, she cried. Not the loud, showy kind, just the quiet, shocked tears of someone who'd been holding their breath too long. I don't deserve this, she whispered. You do, I said. Because you didn't pretend. The rest of the week was a ledger of endings and beginnings. I closed the last joint account tied to Daniel's fake LLC. I signed the sale orders for the lake cabin, the downtown condo, and a patch of land they'd all forgotten about. Cash that would never see their hands. And I started the paperwork for something Richard would have loved, the Carver Second Chance Fund, a grant for widowed women over 60 who'd been shoved out of decisions and left to pick up scraps. I didn't want a plaque. I wanted a ripple. By Friday, the contractor was at my place, replacing the rotting fence panels Richard and I had ignored for years. The sound of the hammering felt like punctuation. At sunset, I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee and thought about the first night in Daniel's dining room, when Vanessa told me to sit down and shut up. I could still feel the sting of it. But now it felt like the start of a fuse, not the end of a story. I didn't know then that the fuse wasn't done burning, because the following week an envelope arrived in my mailbox. Not from Harold, not from Peter, not from anyone I recognized. And inside was something that told me the Carvers weren't the only ones who thought they had a claim to Richard's legacy. The envelope was thin, the paper cheap, the kind you buy in bulk when you're mailing bad news or overdue bills. No return address, just my name typed in blocky black letters. Inside was a single photocopy of a handwritten page. The ink was faded, but I recognized the slant immediately. Richard's handwriting. Beneath it, a short note in a stranger's hand. This belongs to you, we should talk. CD. A phone number followed. The photocopy itself was unsettling. It looked like the torn edge of a letter, just a fragment. Richard's writing read, "Final arrangement with Charles is to be kept separate. Maggie doesn't know yet, make sure the papers are safe." My hands went cold. Charles. I knew one Charles, Charles Denton. Richard's old business partner from the early years before he started his own company. I hadn't heard that name in over 2 decades. I called Harold immediately. "We've got a problem," I said, reading the note aloud. "Or an opportunity," he countered. "If this is about Denton, it could explain some of the gaps in Richard's financial trail." "Want me to make contact?" "No," I said. "If someone's reaching out to me directly, I want to look them in the eye." That night, I dialed the number. It rang 4 times before a man's voice, dry, careful, answered. "Mrs. Carver. I didn't think you'd call this soon." Then you don't know me, I said. What do you have? Not over the phone. Meet me at the Red Lantern Cafe on Route 12. Tomorrow, 10 a.m., bring no one. The line went dead. The Red Lantern was a dim, quiet place with too much red vinyl and the smell of burnt coffee baked into the walls. He was already there when I arrived. Mid-70s, wary, wearing the kind of thrift store suit that says you've either fallen from grace or never climbed to begin with. Charles Denton, I asked. He shook his head slightly. Clifford, Denton's nephew. My uncle's gone. But I found something while clearing out his things. A box marked RC Private. It's about your husband. And it's not small. He slid a manila envelope across the table. Inside were ledgers, old contracts. And, at the bottom, a faded photograph of Richard and Denton standing beside a man I didn't recognize. On the back, in Richard's writing, was one word: insurance. I looked up. What is this? Proof, Clifford said quietly. Proof that your husband was holding something over people you've never even met. And that's why someone else might come knocking soon. The word sat on the back of that photograph like a dare. Insurance. Not the kind you pay premiums for. The kind you keep in a locked drawer in case the wolves get too close. I slid the photo back into the envelope and looked at Clifford. Why bring this to me? I asked. Because my uncle kept saying Richard was the only one who could shut it all down. Clifford leaned forward, his voice low. And if that's true, you're the only one who can now. Which means someone else is going to try to make sure you don't. The weight of his words settled in. My fight with Daniel, Vanessa, and Lucas had felt like a war, until now. This was something different, something bigger. When I got home, I laid the contents of Clifford's envelope on the dining table, right beside Richard's folder. Old contracts I'd never seen, signed by names I didn't recognize. Bank transfers between accounts in places Richard had never mentioned. Delaware, Nevada, even one in the Cayman Islands. And those ledgers, neat columns of figures that didn't match anything in our estate records. By midnight, I'd pieced together enough to see the outline. Richard had been part of something, briefly, maybe reluctantly, that involved money moving through shell companies. And Denton had kept records. The photograph, I realized, was probably the only visual proof tying Richard to it. The question was, had Richard kept this as leverage against Denton or against someone else entirely? I called Harold the next morning. Can you run background on a list of names? I asked. Send them over. And Maggie. His tone sharpened. Be careful who you talk to. If Richard kept this quiet, there's a reason. By the end of the week, Harold had news. 2 of the names on those contracts belonged to men who'd been indicted for fraud 15 years ago. Another was currently a major donor to a political campaign in the state. And one, just one, was still active in a company that had done business with Richard's firm as recently as the year before he died. That same afternoon, a black SUV idled across the street from my house for over an hour. Tinted windows, no plates on the front. The driver never got out. I stood at the window with my coffee, staring back at that dark glass until it finally rolled away. It wasn't my family I was worried about anymore. And for the first time since Richard died, I realized the fight I thought I'd finished had only been the warm-up. 3 days after the SUV sighting, the first knock came. It wasn't a polite, neighborly knock. It was slow, deliberate, and heavy enough to make the wood in the doorframe shudder. I looked through the peephole. 2 men, both in dark coats, no badges visible. One had a folder under his arm. The other scanned the street like he expected company. When I opened the door, I kept the chain on. Mrs. Carver, the man with the folder, asked. His voice was smooth but not friendly. Who's asking? We're here on behalf of an interested party with questions about certain business arrangements your late husband had with Charles Denton. I met his gaze without blinking. Then you can call my lawyer. His name's Harold Finch. He smirked, like I just told him my dog would bite. Would prefer to keep this off the record. Then you're at the wrong door. And I shut it. They didn't knock again. But when I peeked out the front window, the black SUV was back at the curb. That night I called Harold and told him everything. He didn't sound surprised. Sounds like someone's spooked that Denton's records aren't where they left them, he said. If they can't intimidate you into handing them over, they might try other angles, such as, you still have family who think they're owed something. People like this can use greed as a lever. He was right. The next morning, Daniel showed up unannounced, hands shoved deep into his coat pockets, jaw tight. Mom, I need to ask you something straight. Did Dad leave anything else? Anything that could cause trouble? Why? Because someone's been calling me, asking about you, about documents, offering money. I let that sit for a beat. And did you take it? His eyes flashed. No. But I'm not stupid enough to think they'll stop. Then you'd better be smart enough to understand something. I said, whatever they think they want, it's not theirs. And if you're tempted to help them, don't. I'm a harder opponent than they are. He didn't answer. But when he left, I saw the way he glanced down the street at the SUV before getting into his car. By that evening, Nora called me in a panic. Grandma. Someone came by Dad's place while I was there, said they were friends of yours. They wanted to make sure you were being taken care of. They were lying. I could tell. The line went quiet for a second, and then she said the thing I'd been waiting to hear. I think they're going to try something. I looked at Richard's folder on the table, then at the Denton envelope beside it. They were about to find out what happens when you corner someone who's been holding the real insurance all along. If there's one thing Richard taught me, it's that you don't just hold leverage. You use it when the timing makes the most noise. For a week, I let the calls pile up. Daniel stopped trying to hide that he was spooked. Vanessa, despite her probation, started leaving me chirpy voicemails that all ended with, "We can work this out." And that black SUV kept appearing, different parking spots, same tinted glass. So I made a call of my own. It was to a local journalist, Ruth Kessler. We'd met years ago when she interviewed Richard for a piece on small, town business owners. Ruth had a reputation for two things: digging where she wasn't wanted, and never losing a source. "I've got something for you," I told her. Two somethings, actually. One involves my late husband's business partner and a set of records he left behind. The other involves my family's misguided efforts to take what isn't theirs. She didn't hesitate. When and where? Sunday, noon. The Red Lantern Cafe. Bring a recorder. The trick was getting everyone else there. Daniel and Lucas were easy. I sent a message to the family group chat. "I've decided to talk. Meet me Sunday at noon. You'll want to hear this." For the men in the SUV, I made it even easier. I called the number on the card one of them had, accidentally, dropped in my mailbox. "You want Denton's files?" I said. "Come to the Red Lantern on Sunday, noon. Bring whoever you work for." When Sunday came, I arrived 10 minutes early, Ruth already in the corner booth with her recorder on the table. At 11:59, Daniel and Lucas walked in, eyes flicking to each other, then to me. Vanessa trailed behind, oversized sunglasses back in place like they were armor. And right on cue, two men in dark coats entered. SUV men. One spotted the envelope on the table in front of me and smiled like a fisherman who'd just seen the line go taut. "I'm glad you're all here," I said. This will save me repeating myself. I slid the envelope toward Ruth. Inside are Denton's ledgers, contracts, and one photograph tying every name in those papers together. Copies have already been sent to my attorney and a secure location. If anything happens to me, they go public. The SUV man's smile flattened. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. Vanessa crossed her arms tighter. "Now," I continued, "you're all going to hear the same thing at the same time, so there's no confusion later. Whatever Richard was involved in back then, I have no intention of selling it, hiding it, or letting it be used to hurt anyone. except if someone tries to hurt me or my granddaughter. Then it becomes my insurance. I leaned forward, eyes on the SUV men. And that means if you're here to intimidate me, you've already lost. Because now you're sitting across from a reporter. Ruth clicked on her recorder. The SUV men stood. Daniel looked like he might be sick. Vanessa muttered something about overplaying your hand, but I didn't care. Because in that moment, every person at that table knew the same thing. I wasn't the target anymore. I was the problem, and I intended to stay that way. By Monday morning, the Red Lantern meeting was no longer a secret. Ruth's article went live at dawn. Vermont widow holds keys to decades. Old business scandal. It didn't name every name, but it named enough. Charles Denton, Richard Carver. Unidentified corporate operatives seen attempting to acquire sensitive documents. The rest was just enough speculation to make half the town, and a few people far beyond it, start asking questions. The phone started ringing before breakfast. Reporters' old acquaintances. One voice I didn't recognize telling me to watch my back. Before hanging up. The SUV was gone from the street, but it didn't make me feel better. Harold called at noon. Brace yourself, he said. One of those companies tied to Denton's records just filed a motion in federal court to seal any related documents. That's code for, they're scared you have more. They're not wrong, I said. And your family, he asked. They'll break before I do. That same afternoon, Daniel showed up again, no coat this time, sleeves rolled up like he meant business. But his hands were shaking. You've put us in danger, he said. Those people don't care about laws. They don't care about reporters. If you think you can just sit in that house with your insurance and nothing will happen. Daniel, I cut in. Do you think for a second they'll stop if I hand them everything? They'll take it, and then they'll make sure I can't tell anyone what I gave them. You're talking about surrender. I'm talking about survival. He didn't have an answer for that. That night, Nora came over. She'd been quiet since the cafe, but now she sat at my kitchen table and said, Grandma, you have more than just those papers, don't you? I smiled. I have enough to make sure they can't move without stepping into their own trap. What's the plan? End it, I said simply. Publicly. In a way that makes it impossible for them, or your father, to come after me again. The plan was risky, but it played to my strengths: patience, precision, and the fact that no one ever expects a 67-year-old widow to fight like she's got nothing to lose. Step 1. Give Ruth the green light to publish the photograph and the names, all of them. Step 2. Coordinate with Harold so copies of every contract, transfer, and ledger land on the desks of the right federal investigators at the same time. Step 3. Make sure the delivery is so public that no one can pretend it didn't happen. By the end of the week, Ruth had her story queued. Harold had his courier lined up. I had my moment pick at a public town hall meeting, cameras rolling. If this worked, I'd walk out the front door with my head high and no more shadows parked on my street. If it didn't, well, I'd still walk out the front door. The town hall was packed before the clock even struck 7. Reporters clustered in the back, their cameras already trained on the podium. Locals filled the folding chairs, whispering in low tones. Some had come for answers, others for spectacle. A few, judging by the suits, weren't from here at all. I walked in with Harold on one side and Nora on the other. The room went quiet in that strange way it does when everyone wants to stare without being caught. The moderator welcomed everyone, then gestured for me to step up. I didn't rush. Let them watch me. Let them underestimate me. I was told. I began, my voice steady. That certain things should stay buried. That speaking out would cause trouble. That a widow should keep her head down and her mouth shut. A ripple went through the crowd. In the second row, Daniel shifted in his seat, looking anywhere but at me. Vanessa sat stiff beside him, jaw tight. I pulled the manila envelope from my bag and set it on the podium. This, I said, is the truth my late husband's business partner tried to hide. Contracts, transfers, records tying their operations to shell companies in 3 states, and a photograph of every man in that room when the deal was struck. From the back, the SUV men stood, as if considering a move. But the moment they saw 2 federal agents step out from the side entrance, they froze. I nodded toward Ruth, who was already holding up her recorder. A full copy of this has been sent to the press and to federal investigators. If you were hoping to make it disappear, you're too late. For a moment, no one moved. Then, from somewhere in the back, someone started clapping. It spread, slow then building, until the whole room was a wall of sound. Daniel's face was pale, his lips tight, but he didn't speak. Vanessa's sunglasses stayed on, but her knuckles were white where she gripped her purse. The SUV men quietly slipped out the side door, their exit shadowed by the agents. When the meeting ended, Ruth leaned in. You realize they're going to come at you harder now. They can try, I said. But the difference is, now they'll have to do it in daylight. That night I sat at my kitchen table, sipping tea while Nora read the first headlines off her phone. Every word felt like air clearing after a long storm. It wasn't over, not entirely. But for the first time in years, I could feel the balance shifting, away from fear, toward something stronger. 2 weeks after the town hall, the storm finally began to settle. The federal agents had followed up with me twice, each time with more questions and fewer poker faces. Denton's name was all over the filings. Some of the shell companies had already folded under scrutiny. Others were in freefall. The SUV men didn't come back. Daniel and Vanessa did, once, but not to apologize. They wanted to discuss the family estate, again, as if I'd suddenly forgotten the past year. I walked them to the door without offering tea. The surprising call came from Lucas. I'm sorry, he said, stumbling over the word. I let Dad push me into things I didn't believe in. I should have spoken up. You still can, I told him. The truth isn't a one-time thing. Lucas, it's a habit. Either you live it or you don't. He didn't answer right away, but I heard the weight in his silence. Maybe, in time, he'd decide which side he was on. Nora flourished in the quiet that followed. She started classes again, volunteered at the library on weekends, and laughed more often. Real laughter, the kind that doesn't check the room first. One evening she asked, "Do you think they'll ever try again?" They might, I said honestly. But the thing about people like that, they hate sunlight. And we've flooded their world with it. As for me, I spent my mornings walking the frost, tipped trails behind the house, my afternoons tending the garden. Sometimes I'd see Ruth's articles trending online, the story spreading far beyond our town. I didn't chase the spotlight, but I didn't hide from it either. For the first time in decades, my life belonged to me. I learned that age doesn't make you weaker. It makes you sharper. People will count on you to stay quiet, to fade into the background, to play the role they've written for you. But you can step off that stage any time you choose. Family can be your fiercest ally or your deepest wound, and sometimes they're both in the same week. Protect what matters, but don't be afraid to burn bridges that lead only to harm. If this story made you think about the power of speaking up, even when it's hard, tell me in the comments. Have you ever had to stand your ground against people you thought you could trust? Like, share and subscribe so more people can hear stories like this one.